First, why are we talking about APIs? Because API is a value creator, and I can't highlight this enough. It's really a value creator because it offers the organizations with the opportunity to make their products and services accessible to the world. And because API represent the largest growing attack surface for organizations and sort of offers the adversaries a scalable and fully remote way to attack. So this topic is close to my heart. API governance is part of cybersecurity governance, and I would like to share my perspective with you today. It is particularly important because API provide hackers an easy entry point into the enterprise networks and systems. Let's move on to the next slide. Well, you can see here the rate of unique API attacks. It has increased with 60% year over year from 2022 to 2023, which is quite shocking. And a recent report from VentureBeat shows that 41% of the organizations experienced an API security incident in the last 12 months. And 63 of those incidents resulted in a data breach. API hacking is just cost effective because it has the ability to execute large scale attacks. And this should be indeed an urgent call for all organizations to consider implementing better API development and management hygiene. But why is API security particularly important in the automotive sector? Because the consequences extend beyond financial or reputational damage. They put human lives at risk. And we know vehicles are no longer just machines that moves us from point A to point B, but they have sort of transformed into a complex interconnected systems on wheels. And API in the automotive industry are essential for basically enhancing vehicle functionalities, for safety, and also for user experience. They enable real-time vehicle tracking. They can do quite a lot of stuff like diagnostics, integration with infotainment systems, voice assistant, navigation services. And they also can sort of facilitate the advanced driver assistance systems and vehicle to everything communication, which was also pointed out in the earlier presentation. So APIs serve as a critical gatekeepers. They sort of abstract the underlying complexity of systems they interact with and provide a simplified and consistent interface. However, if this interface is not properly secured, it can lead to catastrophic damage. Imagine if a hacker gains control over your car's GPS and sends you to the wrong location. Or even worse, it can control your car speed. And this is not impossible because security researchers have managed to access and control multiple vehicles from various manufacturing companies by exploiting an API broken object level authorization, the so-called BOLA, and sending an API request via telematic service provider on a unique field ID. And they were basically able to remotely start, stop, lock, and unlock vehicles. So what do we need to do to manage API securely? We should definitely adopt good API governance practices. And now let's take a deep dive on what is an API governance. What is the API governance? So basically, API governance is the set of policies, procedures, standards, best practices that an organization implements in order to manage the APIs effectively, so that they can ensure that APIs are secure, reliable, and compliant with regulations. And this way, organizations can enhance their API infrastructure, they can protect sensitive data, and provide a better experience for both developers and users. As I pointed out earlier, API governance is part of cybersecurity governance, which in turn is part of corporate governance. Cybersecurity governance refers to the set of regulations that guide how an organization manages and protects its information assets in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triad. And cybersecurity exists to help the organization achieve its business objectives. In this regard, it makes absolutely no difference from other departments. Cybersecurity objectives must align with organizational objectives. And this is crucial. If this alignment is not achieved, then it is very unlikely, I would say, that cybersecurity teams will receive the necessary support and resources to do their job. Well, in the whirlwind of innovation, deadlines, and productivity pressures, even the most seasoned developers might overlook some aspects of API security. And such issues can be like communication gaps, unclear responsibilities, or even simply human errors. And this modern shift towards other technologies like microservice architectures can also introduce API security issues. So you see, we do have API security issues coming from different directions. And if these communication points are not adequately secured, then the system trust boundaries can basically be breached, which will eventually lead to unauthorized access or data breaches. Therefore, it is crucial to adopt API governance practices to sort of standardize the API security within the organization. So if you would ask me to define API governance with one single word, then it would be standardization. Now, let's take a deeper dive into what are the key components of API governance. First of all, know your assets. The foundation of API governance is understanding what you have in place. Like, draw up an inventory of APIs that you're using or maintaining within the organization. And also classify them according to the confidentiality of the data they are handling. With limited resources, we can't and we should not try to protect everything. We must prioritize our efforts on the most critical areas. So draw up an inventory of APIs, get to know what you have in use, and then classify them to understand what is critical and what is not. The second is policy management. Basically, API governance has a strong focus on drafting policies and procedures for different aspects of API management, such as authentication, authorization, encryption practices. So you basically define who can access your APIs. You can set requirements for rate limits or usage quotas to prevent abuse and ensure fair use of APIs. You know, APIs are vulnerable to a variety of attacks, which includes injection attacks, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, and also DOS, denial of service attacks. Regarding access control, you should define how the access is managed through API keys and tokens and other access control mechanisms if you have in use, and also define roles and permissions for users and developers who are accessing the APIs. Standardization is another crucial component. There are basically requirements to establish consistent API design practices. So you should define like naming convention, encryption protocols, versioning, and comprehensive documentation of company APIs. So it sort of goes deeper into stipulating the protocols like REST or SOAP or GraphQL, and also the data formats that will be used. Compliance is basically has a strong focus on adhering with industry-specific regulations and standards such as GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS, or ISO 21434, which is for automotive industry. You know, in the automotive industry, there are strict regulatory requirements for safety and data protection. So API governance is crucial in making the company compliant with such regulations. Another important component is to define requirements for tracking API performance metrics, such as response time, uptime, error rates, to understand the demand, but also to detect anomalies and plan for scaling. And lifecycle management, it basically defines the entire life cycle of an API, from creation to deployment to versioning, deprecation, and retirement. And last but not least, documentation. There's a strong requirement coming from different regulators and standards to provide detailed documentation for your APIs. This should include like description of endpoints, authentication methods, parameters, expected responses, and any other relevant information for your APIs. Well, how does API governance promote safer APIs? First of all, it protects APIs from potential threat and vulnerabilities, and it sort of ensures integrity and privacy of data. And this is done by stipulating the controls inside the policies and procedures on how to develop and maintain secure APIs. It ensures consistency, that like all APIs should follow a standardized design and implementation approach, which makes them easier to use and integrate with each other. It helps in meeting regulatory requirements and avoid legal issues. It improves the efficiency of API development and maintenance processes. On the other hand, it also provides better visibility into API performance and usage, which will absolutely help management take informed decisions. And it facilitates scaling of API infrastructure by providing clear guidelines and monitoring mechanisms. Well, what are the winning strategies for a secure API development? I like to start always with a risk assessment. For me, this is the cornerstone for every initiative to make APIs and cybersecurity processes in general more secure. So first of all, let's define what is risk. How do we calculate risk? Well, risk is the probability of a given threat to exploit a vulnerability and cause a negative impact to the organization. With that being said, if we have a threat but not a related vulnerability and vice versa, then there is no risk. And according to international standards for risk management, such as ISO 27005, ISO 31000, or FAIR methodology, or NIST 837, there is a common agreement on calculating risk based on the multiplication of impact and likelihood. So we should really go and check those critical, at least the critical APIs, check what are the vulnerabilities and what are the threats related to these APIs. What kind of data do these APIs have access to? So is it like read-only, or could an adversary potentially utilize it to control a vehicle remotely? This makes a huge difference, right? So the interconnected impact of the API on another API used by the organizations should also factor in when assigning a risk score to any API. Considering that the logic exposed by a single API can provide key insights that may enable a different API to be exploited, should also be considered during the risk assessment and threat analysis. So first of all, identify your APIs, identify data which are exposed by each API, and then classify them based on the sensitivity of the data they handle, like confidential, internal, secret. It depends on the classification scheme that the organization is using. And then try to do a threat modeling. Like you can use threat modeling frameworks like Stride to actually identify what are the potential threats and what are the threat vectors that can basically impact your APIs. And then we need to assess vulnerabilities. We need to conduct a vulnerability assessment to identify the weaknesses in API security. For this, we can use like tools for static and dynamic analysis or even manual code reviews. After identifying the threats and vulnerabilities, we then need to evaluate the impact and likelihood for each identified risk for each API. And then assign risk scores based on impact and likelihood to prioritize risks and basically identify what can be the mitigating controls to manage those risks. And of course, an important component is to regularly monitor API for new threats and vulnerabilities. So it is very important to involve the relevant stakeholders in this process, including developers, security teams, and business owners, and have a clear communication of risks and mitigation plans. Another important strategy is to implement an API gateway. API gateways can basically handle important tasks such as authentication, authorization, ensuring that only legitimate users or services can access the APIs. They can implement various authentication protocols like OAuth, OpenID, and JSON Web Tokens, and they can enforce rate limiting and throttling policies to protect against attacks. So there is definitely a huge benefit of centralizing this security mechanism in a gateway. And this way, organizations can basically ensure a consistent security posture across their APIs. We have to think about authentication and authorization as a very crucial component. So if possible, we have to implement a zero trust security model where every API request is authenticated and authorized. We should assume that threats can come from both inside and outside of our network. So use API keys to identify and authenticate requests from developers, from applications, and implement token-based authentication for secure session management. And don't forget least privilege principle. So we got to define roles and permissions for every different user and application that are accessing the APIs, and ensure that they have only the minimum necessary permissions. Well, another component is ensure data protection. So we got to use encryption, use HTTP to encrypt data in transit between the client and server, and encrypt data at rest using strong encryption algorithms. Of course, critical data sort of have more requirements than those data which can be internal or public. So we gotta focus on the data classification levels, and encode API responses to prevent any injection attacks. A secure design and development. Here I have a strong recommendation on following the OWASP guidelines for secure coding. regularly update dependencies and libraries to patch the known vulnerabilities, and implement rate limiting to control the number of requests. Of course, then using throttling to prevent abuse and DOS attacks, and monitoring for unusual activity is also very important. Well, network security is something that we should also consider, because we get HTTP requests, or we get requests from different domains which might not be authorized to access our API. So we got to filter this at the network level. A best practice for this is to use web application firewalls to filter and monitor HTTP requests, and configure CORS, the cross-origin resource sharing, to restrict which domains can access your APIs. Documentation and training for developers is very important. So we gotta encourage developers to stay informed about the latest security trends and vulnerabilities, and encourage them to document every security mechanism and authentication methods that are used in the APIs that they are developing. And incident response, absolutely very, very important. We have to make sure that we have an incident response plan in place for any API security incident that might happen, and ensure that plan includes procedures for detecting, responding, and recovering from security breaches. Well, keeping APIs secure in 2024, it's a big challenge. And this is the time of AI, and how can we keep up with this pace is by embracing AI. AI is expected to become a key tool for black hat actors by assisting them to complete large-scale attacks and reduce entry barriers. We are basically seeing AI to be being used in like mapping CVEs, targeting APIs, and for identifying potential vulnerabilities, like even zero-day vulnerabilities. And not only that, but also to provide scripts for exploiting these vulnerabilities. So the good news, though, is that AI can also be used for enhancing cybersecurity teams' capacities. So it can basically enhance API governance through various means and leverage its capabilities in data analysis, in automation, and also in anomaly detection. So here are some ways how AI can assist in API governance. First of all, AI has the capacity to continuously monitor API traffic and usage patterns to detect and prevent unauthorized access or potential breaches or any other security threats in real time. And machine learning algorithms can identify unusual behavior and anomalies that might indicate a security issue or attack. And they can do this by constantly comparing the current usage patterns with historical data, which is quite difficult to be done by humans, especially in a real time. AI can analyze large volumes of API usage and provide us insights on how APIs are being used. And this will definitely help us to optimize performance and ensure compliance with usage policies. AI can also predict potential bottlenecks, because we are not only focused on confidentiality of data, we also want to make systems available. So we got to make sure that availability and integrity is also covered from our security controls. Other than that, AI can help ensure that APIs comply with relevant regulations and standards by conducting real-time risk assessment, automated compliance checks, and it can assist in managing different versions of API, ensuring that the deprecated versions are phased out properly and the updates do not introduce new vulnerabilities. And it can definitely help with the documentation of the API, so it can maintain up-to-date documentation and can assist developers in reviewing the API code for potential security issues or inefficiencies, and can also identify, analyze the behavior of API users to detect deviations from normal patterns, and not only detect that, but also send real-time alerts to administrators when anomalies or potential threats are detected, which will definitely allow security teams for immediate actions. Well, to wrap it up, let's repeat this all together. Effective API governance practices will unlock new upsell opportunities, will safeguard customer data, and deliver added value to the business.